Hello and welcome back to the Joe's Art History Podcast, a podcast which celebrates all things art historical every single day. It's episode 34 and it's the penultimate episode of season 1 of the podcast, and today I've got something really special for you all. As some of you may remember, my second episode of the podcast was all about the Barbican, the incredible Brutalist social housing estate in London which people either love or love to hate. If you've listened to the episode, you know that I love all things Barbican and what it stands for. So I was beyond delighted when the brilliant Gaby and Howard, who live in the Barbican, got in touch to suggest an episode offering an insider's view of living there, which I absolutely jumped at, and this is what this episode is about. Gaby and Howard offer a unique inside look into this architectural experiment, the changing perceptions of the Barbican throughout their history of living there, and how this amazing building has kick-started GreyScape, their online site which celebrates and discusses all things brutalist architecture and the amazing concrete community that this has formed over the last 4 years. This is a really special episode and conversation where Gaby and Howard talk openly about their ever-evolving opinion and interactions about the Barbican, and how the city and its opinion of the estate has evolved, why brutalist architecture gets a bad name, and suggests why it's really important to look again at these buildings and what they tell us about the time periods they were built in. Thank you so much to Gaby and Howard. This was an utter privilege to speak to you both, and I really hope you enjoy it. It's a very special episode. Enjoy. So I think my first question really is, can you remember the first time you heard of the idea of the Barbican?
Well, you're ahead of me on that, aren't you?
Yeah, so when I was 15 or 16, I had a summer job as a messenger for a stockbroker's firm in Bread Street, just off Cheapside. And literally in those days, it was before electronic payments and the internet, obviously. We're talking in the early 70s then. And my job was to take things around, usually at double time. You know, everything was a sprint. And I remember getting sent to deliver something to an address in the Barbican. And I had never been to the Barbican. I walked past London Wall and suddenly in this new world, and I come to a vast building site, because it was still a building site then. And I look over, find the address, it's a trench in the ground. I'm looking down, I'm on the level of Aldersgate Street, looking down, and there are houses there. And one of the address I had to deliver this envelope to was in that trench. Scroll forward to 1994, I move into a house in that trench.
Amazing.
I mean, just when Gaby said we were looking for somewhere to move, we were in a very small place in Wapping, and with 2 young children, we needed to move. And she said, oh, I found this house, and it's in the Barbican. I couldn't believe it when I came here and saw it was
Fully formed.
Fully formed, yes. So I had not thought about the Barbican much from age 16 to 36, but there it was waiting for us.
I think that actually brings up something quite interesting, because when people talk about districts where they're going to live, am I going to stay in town? Am I going to aspire to go out to the sort of the country? The country. Curiously, Barbican rarely came into conversation. It was deemed as something that was disliked, quite odd and misunderstood, and wasn't even in people's conversations.
We had a friend when I was a student who lived here, and we used to like coming to her flat, which was in Andrew's house. And then we always wanted, because I worked as a lawyer in the city, I wanted a short journey time with young children. And moving here meant that I could even come home and, if necessary, go back to work, because it wasn't a remote working then, because I had just a short walk. So that was one of the principal attractions. It wasn't because there was a whole social life, because the city was dead
Oh,
in the
really?
evenings and weekends. And it's only in recent years that the axis of London's cool has moved from the west to the east, out towards Clerkenwell and Hoxton and Hackney.
Well, we were living in Wapping, so we really did we were very close to where all the creative activity was, until Wapping sort of outpriced all of us. But it really was. I mean, you're right. It was a shift. It was a tilt.
It's incredible, really. And kind of, Howard, what you were saying there about the idea of having this short commute, because essentially that was really why they had built the Barbican. It was after, it was this, like you said, it was this 40-acre piece of land that had been bombed out during the war, and it was the city of London trying to figure out what to do with it, and they decided to build the Barbican as this utopian offering for people to live and work within the city.
Oh yeah, it was incredibly creative of them.
But it was also a cynical move involved, which was really about placing an MP in the area.
The City of London had been increasingly depopulated since the 19th century because of all the financial institutions moving in, and they wanted to make sure there was a resident population so that they retained a member of parliament. I mean, it's still only less than 10,000 people living in the city. The funny thing is that the Corporation of London endorsed the building the Barbican. They must have invested a lot of money in doing so, and then spent the next 50 years being embarrassed about it.
Yeah.
They really didn't, it's the great discussion about Brutalist architecture. I think deeply didn't understand it.
I didn't like it. And if you looked at the Arts Centre, it continuously sought to redecorate and reinvent itself so that no one would notice that it was, built in this particular style and sits in the middle of this very modernist brutalist estate. But they've got over that now.
I think they love it now.
Well, that's it. And it kind of had this, because there was a lot of stick attached to it. Because I remember, Gabby, you and I have spoken previously, and then and you said when you guys moved in to begin with, and you would tell people, oh, we live in the Barbican, they would be like, why on earth?
Oh yeah, it was like a whole speech. It was a speech that was deep inside them that I don't even think they even knew existed.
Well, people would just say, oh, how can you live there? I mean, which you would never do. It's so impolite to say to somebody about their home, oh, how can you live there?
And the curious thing is that part of this whole, did you call it a diatribe?
Yeah.
Is that reasonable? But part of the diatribe involved how can you live in the middle of all the concrete? And of course, for those of us living here, and particularly in our case where we look out onto a garden, our experience is very informed by green, change of season, change of weather, change of light.
And peace and quiet.
And peace and quiet, yeah.
It's not a noisy place.
Well, that's it, because the whole sort of thing about the Barbican is that there's no through roads for cars. Everything's very much underground. And does that really help you feel like you're not in the city centre, even though you are?
Well, it's in a way, the answer, there's a complication in the answer, because underground or below ground, sort of subterranean life where we are here. But if you're living in one of the tower blocks, one of the high rises, you're absolutely informed with every view that you are in the middle of one of the greatest cities in the world.
Yeah, but you're inside, and one of the great things about the design, and I think it was absolutely deliberate, is to create this inside-outside sense. It's not an accident that it's so very difficult for visitors to navigate. And that place is much more accessible when you're a resident, because you can go on the internal paths, you have a key that opens gates. That's deliberate to create this sense of being inside, and visitors are extremely welcome, but they stay to the bits outside and they're scratching their heads how to find anything.
Yes, because one of the sort of loved views is of the waterfall, but they can't get to it.
Oh, this is one of the images that you sent me, is this incredible waterfall into this. Is this a communal, is this the pond that's beside the sort of the theatre that backs onto it? Is this one?
So it's there's the lake is divided in two. There's the lake in front of the Arts Centre, the terrace of the Arts Centre, and then it continues beyond the high walk that leads into the arts centre, and that part is all only accessible if you're a resident. So people on the high walk or on the terrace can see all that, but they can't get there.
And also, I think, did we send a picture of Frobisher Court? I think that people maybe can't get there at the moment.
Yeah, no, at the moment, Frobisher Court, this wonderful crescent, sent you a photograph when it was draped. So they summer before last, they ran a series of outdoor movies there in summer in Frobisher Crescent, and that one was dressed for 2001: A Space Odyssey. So it was great. You sat outside and you watched this fantastic Stanley Kubrick movie, and they had these sheets of fabric from the first stories of the Frobisher Crescent building down to the ground, and they were very dramatically lit.
Because it's not normally lit.
No.
But just to clarify, at the moment, I believe it's still locked. You can't get there unless you're a resident.
Yeah.
And that's all part of kind of the lockdown to do with COVID.
Oh, so there's this sense of a community and really sort of using the spaces. When you moved there, for example, you said you had 2 young children. You have the school there, you have the arts centre, the gardens. Did your kids go to the schools that were there, or did they go elsewhere? Or
no, they didn't. They didn't go to the City of London Girls' School, but they did grow up in the garden. I mean, they were 6 and 4 when we moved here, and there's a playground with where you can play football, and the goals and the baseball hoop and a basketball hoop rather, and there used to be a tennis net, and then there were the swings and all the other stuff. And the great thing is that you could let them go out on their own and run around this very, very large garden and ride their bikes around it. So yeah, we embraced that. We
I just want to speak about the school at the moment, because it's quite interesting, because the school, one would think that it would be the local high school. But it isn't. It's London's local high school, and it's highly competitive to get in there. And my understanding is it isn't necessarily to do with whether or not you're a resident. I don't think that gives you sort of brownie points. In the case of, it would have been our daughter, because it's a girls' school, she absolutely said, "No way am I going to school at the end of the garden." It was like, that is too near.
And there's been a
she went to Latimer Upper.
So there's been a good deal of tension with the girls' school in recent couple of years, because over the years, from its original placement, it's expanded. It put on at least, I think, perhaps 2 upper stories, and has expanded on its footprint. And then it came up with a plan about 3 years ago that it wanted to build a primary school in a car park. I mean, an underground, exactly. Your expression says it all. I mean, that was just a nutty idea to turn these children into moles. Then it came up...
There's a new headmistress or master now. Let me just add.
Then it came up with a much more concerning plan. I mean, one that was realistically being argued for, and that would have meant that on the western side of the school, the bit that faces the church, there is an open area where there are these huge pilotis columns, and there's really lovely staircase down, but it's open area. They wanted to enclose that and turn it into a cafeteria. And
for the students.
For the students.
Yeah.
But there was a concerted campaign to stop it, because it was offensive.
SOS Barbican.
Yeah, offensive to the design. This is grade 2 listed.
Well, this was my next question. Yeah, because I would have assumed, because it's listed, you can't change the infrastructure or
there's levels of listing. I think you go next to grade 2 starred, and that gets more complicated. And I was involved in the past with a grade 1 listed building. That's where you're really under territory. It is very difficult to change everything. My understanding, and I'd love somebody to let me know if that's accurate, is that the Barbican had the opportunity to get the star, the grade 2 star, and didn't want it.
No.
But if we think historically, what is it about the City of London, this area? It has constantly changed through time. We think much more deeply about conservation than any previous generations, and we see it as offensive, decided that just because there's a gap you can put something in it. It's misunderstanding the nature of the whole estate. But I don't know where we will land, in the sense there have been changes before, so they weren't sort of going into uncharted territory. But I think it will be interesting because the city is potentially about to have a very big change because of the outcome of lockdown, how our working lives has changed. So.
Yes, the corporation needs to make sure it has a lot of responsibilities, and it will want to make sure that lost revenue is made up. If you look at what the city did in response to the construction of Canary Wharf, it was low rise, and high rise buildings were not allowed in the square mile. And the corporation's planning body dropped those rules like a hot potato.
Yeah, one night.
In response to Canary Wharf. And so while some of the views of St Paul's are preserved, there's a whole mishmash of buildings, and a lot of people would say that they don't reflect well on cohesive design and story to the city. Others would say they show its energy and entrepreneurialism, etc., etc. But for us living in the Barbican, I think that the Corporation London will look at these large unused car parks. We know they already have. I mean, people don't keep cars the way they did. So there's a lot of spaces in the car park, and figure out what can we do to make more money out of this place. That's not illegitimate. But,
it's so interesting. But like you said, I mean, you've lived in the Barbican since 1994. You must have seen so much change in and around, maybe not so much the estate, but you're very close to like the big financial districts, the markets there. Has that brought a change of people sort of in and out of the Barbican? Have you seen it change from maybe like very student based to family to a range of people?
I think that when we moved in, there were a lot of retired people living here.
Oh, okay.
A lot of people, there were people who had bought pied-à-terres, and somewhere to stay in the week before they went off to the country at the weekend. There are far fewer of those now. I mean, people say to us, "Oh, you live in Barbican. Where do you live in the weekend?" So, no, we're in the Barbican.
Barbican.
Yeah, they were thrown by that. Do you have things to do at the weekend? It was like a quite strange.
And of course, we're so lucky now, because if you like theatre and movies, we can get to restaurants, interesting restaurants and retail is all east. This is where the creativity is now, and we're so well placed for that. A bus ride or a short cab ride, and we're there. And
but also going back to your core question, there were arguably waves. I think we were part of a new type of person coming back into central districts of London, and sort of in parallel, it was happening in Hackney, it was happening in Stoke Newington.
Yeah.
So these are places where everybody has sort of moved out of in the 1970s, I think, probably before way before our time.
So our generation, you know, the bourgeois imperative of the generation was, if you did well, you'd have a nice house in a suburb.
Yeah, that was kind of like where one wanted to be.
And
but it turned on its head, but not just in London. This was happening worldwide. And part of that we saw in Wapping, because people suddenly wanted to be near the river. The idea of living by the river was suddenly something really aspirational. So we saw the ways we were a type, let's say. So we met lots of other families coming in at the same time, many of who have remained actually. And then that sort of tootled on for a while. And I would say sometime after 2000, we started to see more people who worked in creative industries coming in. We also had the benefit because we lived out of the UK for a few years, but we were coming back and forth. So to our home, so we could, maybe you see the differences with much more clarity when you have those sort of gaps of time. But certainly after 2015, I'm going to say, it was really clear. At the weekend, you'd have lots of people coming with cameras, and that real understanding of brutalism really kicked in, and people, there was a real, sort of a drop in the age of people coming who would just go and hang out outside the arts centre. And that was really exciting. And I also think that, that's infectious, that sort of stuff, because you could see the exhibitions were much more reflective of the tastes of the people who were coming.
Yeah.
So it was an all-round win.
Yes, you're so right.
That's so interesting, because the first time I came across the Barbican, funnily enough, Howard, a little bit kind of like yourself, I was delivering something to the Barbican. So in my day job, I work for an art gallery, and I was delivering to a client that lives in the Barbican. And of course, there's that sort of the security guard before you go down into sort of the sort of underground car park. And when the taxi driver essentially was like, right, this is as far as I can take you. And I spoke to the security guard, and I was like, what is this build? It was like, because I come from a small mining town just outside of Glasgow, and I've just never seen anything like it. And like you said, with the whole signage, then I had to find this flat. It took me maybe about 25 minutes to find where I had to go. And every time I go to the Barbican, and I spoke to someone about the Barbican, which is actually how we started talking on my second episode in the podcast, and we were sort of like, who was in charge of the signage within the Barbican? They must have had some laugh.
Well, you've just tiptoed right into a huge topic at the moment here about signage, because all these signs are popping up everywhere. New signs, and there's a whole kind of crowd of people who don't like the new signs.
Oh, there's signage.
Well, I think it's I haven't particularly come across it yet, but certainly there's a lot of chatter going on about it. But that's wonderful, because that's indicative of the village aspect.
You would get that coming from a village. I didn't come from a village. I came from East London, so did Gaby. So there wasn't that village atmosphere. And of course, villages are lovely, and they're horrible. They're lovely because everybody knows your business. They're horrible because everybody knows your business. And that's part of the vibe of the Barbican. I remember once we had a note from the Barbican Horticultural Society criticising. We have a flat terrace roof with planters and tables and chairs up there, criticising us and our presentation. And we're not even members of the Barbican Horticultural Society. How dare they?
Well, that's then sparked a question. Then is there certain rules of things that you are and are not allowed to do with the exterior of even your private balcony spaces? Because of course the Barbican has these incredible 3 big towers, and what makes the Barbican so unique is they all have planters, and they all have these very different sorts of plants that cascade down. And I've never thought of, is there a list of things that you can and cannot have, and things that you can change and sort of make tweaks to sort of make it your own?
Plants, I think they're fine with.
Yeah.
No pets.
No pets?
No pets.
Anywhere?
Anywhere. No
Well,
pets.
I'm sure there probably are some.
There are secret house cats, I know. But dogs aren't allowed for sure. So no pets. And I imagine someone would pick you up if you had a fish tank.
The thought police. No, but our front doors are painted the same colour. It's quite
so the listing means we can't change the exterior. And people don't want to exterior. Apparently change the exterior. After this block we live in was first occupied, one of the house owners sought planning permission to put an extra story on because it's a flat roof. And that was stopped. But I mean, it's unthinkable now. It wouldn't happen. You couldn't do it now. But when we bought the house, the previous owner had divided. So the central core is divided by 2 wings that are higher. have an extra
like
story.
an H kind of
Yeah,
idea.
have an extra story. And the one which is the bedroom wing, the previous owner put a mezzanine in and put an extra floor in. Perfect for 2 children to have a room, and an upstairs, downstairs. And he'd never sought the consent of the Corporation of London. So when we moved in, they were very, very keen to come and visit and have a look at it. They weren't going to stop us keeping it, but it was a nice construction. But
yeah, they were positively excited when we invited them. Inviting, the kind of the estate office in and said, look, we became aware that you were interested to see what happens here.
And now there is everything for the interior was designed for the Barbican.
Yeah.
So the kitchens were 50 years ago were absolutely the forefront, cutting edge of what was chic and modern. And they were all built to imperial measures. So when it comes to replacing anything, you can't get the same size anymore because it's metric. And they wore out, but there are people who are passionate about recreating something exactly as it was. And so the original light fittings, of which we have some, the light switches, the bathroom, there's what is known as the Barbican sink, a very compact sink, which so things like that people are searching for, and there's a salvage operation so that people can donate bits and pieces that can be then restored and put into other homes.
There's also some really interesting sort of locking devices on the doors.
Oh wow!
So yeah, it is.
And the Garshi.
Oh gosh, the Garshi. You've come across the Garshi?
No, what's
that? About the Garshi.
So
it's a great word.
It's a waste disposal system. It sits in your sink. We don't have it anymore because it just died for us, but we used it for years. It sits in the sink. You fill it up with waste, pretty much anything. Fill up, drive out all the air with water, and then you just lifted it up and sucked it out. And it would go down into, there are like 7 miles of tunnels under the Barbican.
Wow.
And the waste is taken down into these tunnels. I think it's compacted, and then it's transported and put on barges on the River Thames and taken off to landfill, I presume. When the Garshi, they wanted to, they didn't know what to do with because it seemed to be coming to the end of its useful life. And the company that originally made it had gone out of business years ago. But they found that there's an apartment block in Moscow which has the same system. So it's keeping going for a bit longer.
So some people definitely still have it.
Oh,
I mostly loved it, and occasionally
when it went wrong, you get your arm down.
Oh no.
So no glass went down. But it was, it just speaks to the vision, this vision of this whole environment where everything was thought about, plus the design, which meant you were bound to bump into your neighbours when you went on your walks and things. It's all part of this whole...
It's a design for living. So modern apartment blocks, modern complexes, you go to Chelsea Harbour, you have a gymnasium. We lived in an apartment block in New York, and it had a cinema and a residence lounge and a gymnasium. The Barbican has an arts centre and it has a conservatory. It doesn't have a gym. The Golden Lane estate, just north of us, which was the original Chamberlain, Powell and Bond development, has a wonderful community centre with a very lovely swimming pool. They chose not to do that in the Barbican. I don't think we've lost anything by it. I think we have the leisure aspect, the ability to relax is really within the design. And of course, the apartments are a good size. Everything that went wrong with the great brutalist public developments that became sink estates and heavily criticised, it wasn't brutalism was wrong, it was not enough money was spent to develop them and maintain them. And the Barbican shows what can be done.
It's a really, people sometimes talk to us about this, and I always find it an incredibly unfair comparison. Because if something is built, however well it's built and however well proportioned the rooms are, if somebody doesn't care to light it properly and people don't feel safe, and things are just broken up with repair. So I'm repeating myself. Well, of course, there's no comparison. There's sort of service charges here. They're not small service charges.
It's breathtaking.
But it does mean that the quality of life is incredibly impacted. So I would argue that Robin Hood gardens and the like, had it been dealt with differently from the beginning, could have been incredibly successful.
Yeah, and like you said, it's kind of, it really, for me, when I have read about the Barbican or spoke about the Barbican, it really does sort of, I don't know, speak of the art of living, because the designers and the architects, they thought about every little detail, and it was so innovative. Like you said, everything was made to measure, very sleek. I remember reading this thing about, it had underfloor heating, the flats soundproofed. Everyone was very pleased with that, something they haven't continued in London design since probably the Barbican, because no flat I've lived in London has ever been soundproof. But it's this amazing piece of history. And I mean, how does it feel to live in something that holds such an importance?
Well, my feeling is that I thought it was lovely. I like living here. And as it gradually became more popular, I realized what a privilege it was. It's not cheap to buy a place in the Barbican. Interestingly, it was always cheaper than other places that were considered suitable for aspiring middle-class people.
Yeah, I think that's really true. It lagged behind on price for a long time, not now, but it definitely did. Yeah, I think it's obviously we're very interested in architecture and design and the impact on people. And I agree with you. I think it's a privilege, and there are no positives attached to lockdown. Okay, but if there was a positive, it's being able to truly experience the Barbican, where it becomes your, certainly becomes your world.
Yeah.
The fact that you have gardens and water and not fountains always working or not, but waterfalls. I mean, and it's all seconds away.
Yeah,
that's incredible.
It is. And now we have a granddaughter.
Oh,
so she loves the fact that you come out the front door and 25 meters away is a playground.
So again, it speaks to the design, this aspect of sort of really thinking about what people want and what people need.
Yeah. And of course, it's not just, so the sort of site opens in the 80s, but it's not this sort of new sort of phenomenon, if you will. It's completely entrenched with history within London as well, and I think people forget that. So do you maybe want to tell us about some of the important things that are within the Barbican, or even things that have...
I just wanted to say something, that it was in parallel. There was, Le Corbusier was building, let's say, Tapetation, and anyone who sings French is going to really cringe at that accent. But there were other estates. This was happening elsewhere. Yeah. This idea of people sort of living together in a group. But forgive me, going back to your question. So, well, think about the Roman walls.
Well, to me, I mean, I'm fascinated by history. The fact that when I walk to the post office, I walk along Wallside by the church, and the Roman wall is there. Roman, and then it's the medieval wall, and it continues past the Cripplegate, where there was a huge battle between the Saxons and the Vikings, I believe, and all along the London Wall. Yeah. It's great history. And it's not just that, it's the history of the city. It's the history, you see, if you ever watched the original movie, The Italian Job with Michael Caine, there's a point when he's riding in a milk float early in the morning along London Wall in what must be in the 1960s. And that was it. And not many people know. Anyway, so it's steeped in history. It's lovely. it's not just the ancient history of Roman times, the Guild Hall, and development of the city as an economic centre, but then around it, Smithfield, where martyrs were burned at the stake, and
Wallace.
yes, Wallace must be a hero of yours.
Yeah.
He came to a most unpleasant end just round the corner.
Yeah.
Outside Bart's Hospital. So you do feel you're living in a place where the ghosts are lining up behind you. Thousands of people who've lived here through all sorts of different lives. And I think they've integrated the Barbican design, which obviously Barbican, the name, it has that castle element, parts of it like a walls and with arrow loops in them. It's and crenellations it speaks to. So it still has that sense of being connected to its history.
It's important. I think that's important. That anchors us.
Yeah, we're very fortunate in that respect.
Yeah.
Very fortunate. Yeah, walked to St. Paul's, the famous picture of St. Paul's rising through the smoke during the Blitz.
Yeah, maybe it was the bad aim of the bombers, which ultimately created the fire. Created the. Isn't that one of the things they kept aiming for St. Paul's?
A mist.
Yeah. Well, they didn't. I mean, they did actually bomb it. But.
Yeah, because is there not? There's a plaque in the Barbican where the first bomb fell on the city of London, or supposedly the
That's
first.
right. Yeah. Oh yes, you sense all that. There's a wonderful clip. We put it on our website of a pop group who had some success in the 1960s called Unit 4+2. Performing their hit song, which I can't remember the name.
Concrete and Clay.
Concrete and Clay, on the building site at the Barbican. And what's great is, it wouldn't be like when Stormzy came here to record one of his videos, everything stops for him. When Concrete and Clay was recorded here, the blokes working on the building site, no hard hats inside. I just carry on working and the cement mixers go. And so these are glimpses of a different. If you go to the London archives, there's a Pathé movie about people who moved in here when it first opened, so 51 years ago, and they have some housewives, as they described them. So women with scarves on done up tight under their chins, and they're complaining that there isn't a laundrette on site.
Oh, okay. How interesting.
Of course, there is now. It has been for some years.
So we have a friend who's a photographer, David Hoffman, and he came and photographed the Barbican in 1975, and we have a little zine about it. And it's really wonderful because I walked round with him, was it last year? Or maybe it's 18 months ago, and he kind of retook photographs where those original ones were taken. And there's so many things, cars that are parked where they definitely can't be parked now, a kind of cafeteria that doesn't exist. So everything is evolving.
Yeah,
it's evolving.
It is.
But certainly there's quite a lot of sort of literature around about who the Corporation of London were targeting to become, the flat and house owners here. And it's really interesting what they were looking at, aspiring young professionals.
Those be tenants. Because, one of the things that dramatically changed the Barbican was Margaret Thatcher's right to buy. Because it was mainly tenanted, and a certain number of those had to be social housing tenants, council tenants. Corporation was never crazy about that, obviously, but I don't think it was ever crazy about the right to buy.
No.
Because, it's a long leaseholder and it provides our services, and, by and large, it's a pretty good landlord. But the right to buy changed the character of the place, I'm sure.
And also, that decision had incredibly long reach, which has left us in the position we are now as a country with just a desperate shortage of social housing for people who genuinely need it.
Built anything.
Well, not enough. Nowhere near enough.
No, nowhere near enough.
Well, that's it. Or that they're getting sort of torn down, and that they're not replenished, these sites with social housing. Therefore, particularly in London as well, it's going to these big high-rise flats where you're paying extortionate rates for a tiny cramped 2-bed apartment that's close to $1 million.
Well,
and then
there's a whole debate, isn't it, about allowing buildings to fall into such a state of disrepair that the only solution a particular council might have would be to sell it to a developer, who then, as part of the deal to develop it, only allows so many of the social housing residents to return, and the rest is sold off.
This is what's happened at Balfron Town. Balfron Town, Goldfinger's Brutalist development down in Poplar, was in a state of decay, and a lot of work needs to be done to bring it up to standard in terms of the utilities and the electrical wiring. And the only way they can afford to do it is for flats to be sold on long leases, and that changes the purpose of the building, which was to house the community.
The vision of the architects.
So we have serious issues there.
I have to ask you, obviously, because you've lived in the Barbican for such a long time. Do you think, and of course you run this company called GreyScape, is it from living in the Barbican that sparked this love and want to explore these incredible brutalist creations, not just in the UK but all over the world?
Yeah, it was.
Yes, definitely. The springboard was living here, and sort of seeing how others who came and visited would photograph it, and sort of thinking, gosh, there's more. There's a lot more to this. What about this angle, that angle? It was about the space and the vision as much as the quality of photograph. Is about the photographer's experience. So that, yeah, it was born out of that. But very quickly, as you say, you then get to a place of thinking, wow, okay, so what were Chamberlain Pound 1 thinking of? Were they looking at what Corbusier was doing? Were they looking at what was happening at that point, would have been in the Soviet Union, and constructivism? And yes, it's like yeses. They were looking. And
so we see these architectural tours coming past several times a day at the weekend on the high wall, which is we're looking to our kitchen. And Gaby said, let's put some photographs on Instagram.
I think original. So GreyScape. Why GreyScape? It actually didn't start off. It truly evolved. It was just an Instagram, but then we were talking to people all over the world, and they were talking back at us, and it just became it's like a community, because the whole thing grew organically, and it's really fascinating. We have somebody in Vancouver talking about buildings, where they're living, and then somebody is living in the Urals in the middle of
Ekaterinburg.
Ekaterinburg, yeah, in the middle of Russia, saying,
I've got a building.
I think you want to see this building.
Yeah. And the funny thing is that, that we're always reading about how ghastly social media can be, how really vile to people it can be. Now, our experience of that in 4 years, 4 or 5 years now, 4 years, on our Instagrams is zero.
Yeah.
I mean, every so often someone will
go, I hate it, it's an ugly building.
Yeah.
But then everybody else will engage with them and actually talk about why it's the same with our Twitter as well. It's actually very, very polite.
The people who are vile to each other are the ones who post pictures of little pink pussycats.
And cupcakes.
And cupcakes.
Avoid the cupcake Instagrams, I think. No, I'm talking to the cupcake crowd.
Yeah.
So GreyScape, why did we get to that when it's Barbican? Because we suddenly realized that we're not just talking about the Barbican anymore. It had evolved. But what are we talking about? And it's a grey landscape. GreyScape.
Yes, I mean that was. I mean,
it kind of simplifies it, but truly that is probably.
If you spoke to Chamberlain Powell of Bonn back in the day and said, talked about brutalism, they'd look at you and wonder what the heck you
Yeah,
were on
they
about.
they would not have recognised that as,
So
as a notion.
the real heart of it is modernism, and then the Soviet version of modernism, constructivism. That's the heart of it. And modernism, modernism has all these different pronouncements about what it means. It has certain things in common. It clearly had a social purpose, a socialistic drive to it. There were people who wanted to change the world for the better, harness concrete and readily available electric power to make lives better for people, and they'd be able to build higher, and they'd be able to provide better services.
And the health aspect as well. I mean, that was really, it's not by chance these kind of vast white walls. We featured a really interesting book the end of last year called which I'm crazy about. It's a book called Sun Seekers, and it's all about California and modernist architecture in California, and why everybody heads to California, because of the good health vibes. And a lot of it goes back to TB, wasn't it? TB was a massive problem until I think they figured out in late 1940s, early 1950s about, was it a vaccine, I suppose, for TB? Sounds very familiar territory. And people understood that it was maybe something about fresh air and maybe going up an Alp in Switzerland and sort of sitting and having a sort of a rest cure. But then they began to think, and it was a very modern idea, very modernist idea, that actually bathing in sun was actually important from where we are now sunbathing. There's a beautiful house in California called the Lovell Health House, and that's Dr. Philip Lovell instructed Richard Neutra, one of the great modernist architects, a very important guy, Jewish Viennese, who went to California and built this house for Philip Lovell, who also started life with a very different name. And this house was meant to epitomize the best of modernism, which it did, and also about air circulation. So we're sitting here now with the white walls and the open spaces and the big windows, and so that healthy living aspect of modernism is also completely fascinating.
I mean, neither of us have a background in architecture or engineering, and we've learned. There's much more we need to learn than we have learned. But we approach it, and this concrete community that we talk to, we learn from, are principally people who inhabit buildings, look at them, rather than people who design them. We do have a number of architects and designers who get involved with us, but we always want to keep that voice of people who have, we think, insufficiently is that voice recognised by the powers that be, that the people who have to live in buildings should be able to speak to them. Stakeholders, yeah.
Well, I love that, and I love that also that, like you said, your concrete community, and I love that as this sort of idea of, especially because you live in the city centre, and it's quite difficult to have this idea of a community, but like you were saying, and social media gets a lot of stick, but you can create these incredible places, and it really is a really important learning tool, like what you've done during lockdown, as well as Gaby, when we spoke previously, you were saying you were doing live walkarounds, and suddenly there was thousands of people just tuning in from all over the world. It's incredible.
I mean, I don't want to be too prosaic about this, but we've got no idea whether the people we talk to, we engage with, who send us their comments and posts are left-wing or right-wing, or where they sit politically.
Yeah.
We think they're like people and they care about people. That's great. And frankly, the way the world has been, and certainly during this lockdown, I mean, it's helped us tremendously to have that contact. And I believe that people who write to us and send us photographs, particularly during lockdown, the view from my window project, where they were sending photographs of whatever it was they could see out their window. And it may be very, very unremarkable, but it's a connection.
It was either some incredible sort of lake in one of the Great Lakes of America, or it was garden gnomes in Bethnal Green. I mean, it was like, we said, no, we're just going to upload. We're handing it to you. This our live space.
So it's, when we've all had such a tough time being confined within our walls and cut off from friends and family and recreation, for us, it's been a tremendous way to engage, it has become a passion. I think our family are a bit fed up with us talking about buildings.
Well, I think I have to, sort of wrapping up, I think one of my best sort of questions I have to ask you is, what is your favourite place in the Barbican then for people to come and see? Is there any sort of hidden gems, or do you have a spot that you go to and you feel, oh gosh, I just love this?
I'm interested about your one.
Well, if you walk along London Wall from the Museum of London Roundabout, about 100 metres along, there's an entrance to a car park, a spiral entrance. You can walk down that little access road, and at the bottom is the ruin of a tower, one of the parts of the city wall, and to your right are the remains of buildings that were bombed in the war. They've kept them, and you can just go up onto the grass and you come out to a little lawn, which on the one side is a gate you have to have a key for. It'll take you into the Barbican. Ahead of you to your left is the girls' school, and in front of you is the lake. And that piece of ground has never been built on in the whole history of London. Now,
must be the only piece of ground.
So we know this because one Sunday morning we came along there and walked back through there, and there was a little group of pagans having a ceremony there, because it was this ancient piece
they
of
invited us to join them for the ceremony.
We declined. They're very nice.
Oh, they were lovely. They had wonderful cloaks on.
That's it.
Yeah.
Cloaks on.
Oh, yeah.
But anyway, so to me, that's a magical secret place in the Barbican. And from there you can see the church, and you can see that there's another tower, another medieval tower there, which is in ruins. I think it's a beautiful spot. What about you, Gab?
Oh, mine is actually very easy to sort of find. So podium level, looking down onto the lake, towards the waterfall, onto the sort of sunken garden.
Mm.
It's just a beautifully shaped and designed sort of piece of, I don't know what you call it, landscaping. I don't know what you call it, but it's just lovely. Yeah, it's so simple and it's easy to see. And I have endless pleasure just with an iPhone walking past and taking a snap.
Yeah, it's lovely. So
no, it's incredible.
When lockdown is done, and when you can get back to London.
Yeah.
So we'll take you to these two little spots and give you a tour.
Oh, I would love that. Yeah, I would absolutely love that. Well, you've said it publicly now, so you can go back on it. I've got it recorded and everything. No, I do. I just love the Barbican, and I would always say to people, like, because even now it has this real sort of, people have a real love-hate relationship with the whole aesthetic of it. But I think what's so great about it is it's this snapshot of, post-World War II architecture, but very, very thoughtful architecture. And I think what's so great about London is really beautifully sort of old and new sit side by side. And I think for something like the Barbican now, it's not necessarily a new building, but it still works within London's landscape. And I think we would be a bit worse off without having it there. I just think it's this incredible thing that continues to spark conversations. And I think, what you guys do is proof of that. You have this community of 30 odd, nearly 40,000 strong people who really embrace this whole idea of a concrete community. And I think, what would you say to people that perhaps they're not a fan of Brutalist architecture, and they've never heard of the Barbican, what would you say to them if they were like, it's not really for me?
Well, I'd say come and visit, because I have a suspicion that sentiment often comes from people who've seen a photograph but actually haven't visited and haven't seen the whole that you've just spoken about.
Yes, yeah. Just come and sit on the terrace with a cup of tea or a beer.
Yeah,
and
in
enjoy
the
it.
public area. Just take it in.
A walk through Beach Street Gardens.
Yeah.
Which is just lovely, beautiful. Yeah. We're more people who can come to Barbican, the better.
Well, that's it. And it's such a special place. But I think, like what you said earlier, you know, there's, as more and more people are sort of, you know, gaining interest in it, and you have these incredible sort of theatre productions and art exhibitions, it can only help, you know, entice people to come and explore. And you will get lost, that's the thing, and I think that's part of the fun of it as well. When you're in the Barbican, I sometimes feel like maybe I should bring some chalk just to like mark where I've been.
Well, I think,
who knows?
you know, there's this whole culture mile thing, which is a kind of something being driven by the Corporation of London. I actually think it's a really great idea, and it's not in of itself unlike New York's Museum Mile idea. It's sort of space which is given over to culture. So, as you know, the Museum of London, which is sort of attached to the side of the Barbican estate, is moving in Smithfield Market. There's a lot of different things happening. So it would, I think that really speaks to the future good health of the Barbican estate and people's understanding of it.
Yeah, well, that's it. Thank you both so much for talking to me about your experience of living in this, you know, architectural gem and experiment, and your love of the Barbican. But very quickly, where can people find you and what you do?
So on Instagram, the easiest way is at Barbican_city. It's underscores in between each word, Barbican City of London. And on our website, GreyScape.com.
Amazing. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute honour to speak to you both, and so great to get an insider's view on this incredible piece of architecture.
To speak.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. And there you have it, the end of another episode of the Jo's Art History podcast, and not just any episode, the penultimate episode of season 1. Firstly, I would like to thank Gaby and Howard for coming on and giving us such a brilliant inside scoop to living in the Barbican, and also just giving us a really great history and just a real behind the curtain look at what it's like to live in somewhere so historically important as the Barbican. If you've enjoyed listening to Gaby and Howard, please make sure that you check out what they're up to over on GreyScape. I will leave links to their website and their Instagram in the show notes below. As always, if you would like to get in touch to discuss anything that you've heard today, please feel free to do so. You can find me at Jo's Art History on Instagram. My DMs are always open, or you can contact me via email, joesarthistory@gmail.com. And as always, all images that we discuss throughout the podcast can be found on my Instagram in my highlight reels. So this is episode 34. So if you go to my Instagram at Jo's Art History and find number 34 in the podcast and just click it, it will show you some of the images that we're talking about. If you've enjoyed this episode, please make sure to like, rate and subscribe, as it not only means you'll never miss an episode, but it also helps other people find the podcast, which is always really helpful. And if you're able to, I would really appreciate it if you could leave a review. And if you're watching on YouTube, it would be great if you can just hit the like and subscribe button as well. It would be really helpful. Finally, I've been Jo McLaughlin, your friendly host and resident art historian, and I look forward to welcoming you to the final episode of season 1 of the Jo's Art History podcast next week. Until then, keep learning, and remember, art is for all. Bye.